The October sky over Millbrook, Pennsylvania hung thick and gray on the morning of October 14th, 1993. It was the kind of morning where fog clung to the hills like something reluctant to let go, where the air tasted of damp leaves and the promise of an early winter. Once at Riverside Elementary School, 30 children between the ages of 8 and 10 gathered in the parking lot, clutching permission slips and brown paper lunch bags, their voices rising in excited chatter. They were going to the Allegheny Nature Reserve, a sprawling woodland preserve 2 hours north, for what the school had billed as an educational field trip, learning about ecosystems, wildlife, autumn migration patterns, the kind of wholesome American childhood experience that gets photographed for yearbooks and remembered fondly decades later. Except these children would never make it to the nature reserve, and 31 years would pass before anyone discovered what happened to that yellow school bus. The morning started normally enough. The parents waved goodbye from their cars, some snapping pictures with disposable cameras, preserving images that would later become evidence. The children lined up in pairs the way elementary students do, giggling and pushing and barely containing their energy. 2 teachers accompanied them, Miss Diane Porter, a 28-year-old science teacher beloved by students for her patience and creativity, and Mr. Gerald Hutchins, the 62-year-old vice principal who had volunteered to chaperone at the last minute when another teacher called in sick. The bus driver was a man named Vincent Calhoun. 54 years old, married with 3 grown children of his own, he had been driving for the Millbrook School District for 16 years without incident. His record was spotless. Neighbors described him as quiet, dependable, someone who mowed his lawn every Saturday and waved politely when you passed him on the street. Nothing remarkable, nothing suspicious. Just another face in a small Pennsylvania town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. The bus pulled out of the parking lot at 8:45 in the morning. Security cameras at the school captured the moment, the yellow vehicle turning left onto Maple Street, disappearing behind a line of oak trees that had already begun shedding their leaves. That was the last confirmed sighting. By noon, when the bus failed to arrive at the nature reserve, staff at the facility made their first call to Riverside Elementary. Perhaps there had been a miscommunication about timing. Perhaps they had stopped for lunch somewhere along the route. The school secretary, a woman named Judith Kreis, assured them the bus had left on schedule. She would check with the driver. She called Vincent Calhoun's home. No answer. She called the emergency radio frequency all district buses carried. Static. Silence. By 1 in the afternoon, parents started receiving phone calls. Your child's bus has been delayed. We are working to establish contact. Please remain calm. But small towns do not remain calm when 30 children disappear into thin air. By 2 in the afternoon, the Millbrook Police Department had mobilized every available officer. By 3, the Pennsylvania State Police had been contacted. By 4, the FBI had opened a file. The search began immediately, and it was massive. Helicopters swept the 2-hour route between Millbrook and the Allegheny Nature Reserve, scanning forests and back roads and abandoned properties. Police cruisers traced every possible detour, every side road, every forgotten logging path. Volunteers organized into search parties, combing through woods with flashlights and handheld radios, calling out names that echoed back unanswered. The bloodhounds were brought in, but they had nothing to track. The bus had simply vanished. Over the following days, investigators reconstructed the route. They spoke with gas station attendants, toll booth operators, anyone who might have seen a yellow school bus that morning. Nothing. It was as if the vehicle had driven straight off the edge of reality. 30 children, 2 teachers, 1 driver, gone, no witnesses, no debris, no signs of an accident, no ransom demands, just an empty absence where 33 lives used to be. The families fell apart in slow motion. The parents who had waved goodbye that morning found themselves trapped in a nightmare without resolution. Search parties continued for weeks, then months. Billboards went up across 3 states, displaying school photos of smiling children. Milk cartons carried their faces. Television news programs ran segments, pleading for information. The story dominated regional headlines through the end of 1993 and into early 1994, but as winter gave way to spring, coverage began to fade. The investigation remained open, but active searching tapered off. Life, cruel and relentless, moved forward. Millbrook, Pennsylvania never recovered. The town became known for one thing, the place where 30 children disappeared. Families moved away, unable to bear the weight of unanswered questions. Local businesses closed. The school district eventually shut down Riverside Elementary in 1998, the building too haunted by absence to function. By the early 2000s, Millbrook had shrunk to less than half its former population, a ghost town in everything but name. Theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some believed Vincent Calhoun had orchestrated an elaborate kidnapping, though his own family insisted he loved those children, would never harm anyone. But others suspected a coordinated abduction by a trafficking ring, despite zero evidence of such an organization operating in rural Pennsylvania. Conspiracy theorists proposed government involvement, secret experiments, mass hypnosis. The FBI investigated every lead, no matter how absurd, and found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nothing. In 1995, 2 years after the disappearance, a psychic contacted the Millbrook Police Department, claiming she had visions of the children underground. She described tunnels, darkness, cold water. Detectives, desperate for any direction, followed her guidance to an abandoned coal mine 40 miles from the intended route. They found nothing but empty shafts and stagnant pools. The psychic appeared on a daytime talk show shortly afterward, her credibility in tatters. In 2001, human remains were discovered in a wooded area near the Maryland border. Dental records ruled out any connection to the missing children within 48 hours, but the discovery reopened wounds for families who had tried, painfully, to move on. Several parents gave interviews, their faces aged beyond their years, voices hollow. We just want to know what happened. We just want to bury our children. But there were no bodies to bury, no closure, and only questions. By 2010, most of the original investigators had retired or passed away. The case files sat in a basement archive, thousands of pages documenting a mystery no one could solve. And the children, if they had survived, would have been in their late 20s. Some families held out hope for a miracle. Others had accepted the likelihood that their children were dead, though even that acceptance offered no peace without knowing how or why. And then, in the summer of 2024, a real estate developer purchased 140 acres of forested land 30 miles outside Millbrook. The property had been abandoned since the 1970s when a lumber company went bankrupt and left behind nothing but trails and overgrowth. The developer planned to clear the land for a housing subdivision, capitalizing on a recent population influx to the region. On July 9, 2024, a surveying team arrived to map the property boundaries and assess the terrain. They found the bus on July 11th. It was buried, not hidden behind trees or sunk in a pond. Buried, 15 feet underground, in what appeared to be a deliberately excavated pit, covered with soil and decades of accumulated forest debris. The surveyor's ground-penetrating radar had detected an anomaly, something large and metallic beneath the surface. When the excavation crew broke through the dirt, they uncovered the roof of a yellow school bus. The paint faded but unmistakable, the numbers still visible on the side. District 14, Vehicle 09. Law enforcement arrived within hours. The FBI reopened the case immediately. Forensic teams cordoned off the area, setting up lights and generators as they carefully excavated around the vehicle. It took 3 days to fully expose the bus, and what they found inside would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The children were still in their seats, all 30 of them, still wearing the clothes they had put on that October morning in 1993, backpacks still tucked under seats, lunch bags still clutching sandwiches that had long since decomposed into unrecognizable matter. The 2 teachers sat near the front, Miss Porter's hand resting on the back of a seat as if she had been standing when whatever happened took place. Vincent Calhoun was slumped over the steering wheel. They were all dead, had been dead for 31 years. But the scene inside the bus raised more questions than it answered. There were no signs of violence, no bullet wounds, no stab marks, no blunt force trauma. The preliminary examinations found no obvious cause of death. The bodies had mummified in the sealed environment, preserved by the dry soil and lack of oxygen. Forensic anthropologists would need months to determine exact causes of death, but initial observations were baffling. The children appeared to have simply stopped living, as if some switch had been flipped, turning off 33 people simultaneously. The bus itself told a strange story. The engine was off, the doors were closed, the windows were intact. There was no damage to the exterior, no signs of a collision or mechanical failure. Investigators found the keys still in the ignition. The fuel tank was 3/4 full. Every system on the bus appeared functional, aside from 31 years of deterioration. But someone had buried this bus. Someone had dug a pit large enough to hold a full-size school bus, driven or towed the vehicle into that pit, and covered it with 15 feet of earth. That would have required heavy machinery, excavators, dump trucks, hours of labor. It would have been loud, visible, impossible to do in secret. Yet somehow, in October of 1993, someone had managed exactly that without a single witness coming forward. The location of the burial site raised additional questions. The pit was located on private land that had been abandoned since the 1970s, but it was accessible from a rarely used logging road that branched off from State Route 36. That road was not on the planned route to the Allegheny Nature Reserve. To reach it, the bus would have needed to deviate significantly from its intended path, turning off the main highway onto secondary roads, then onto unmarked trails. Why? Had Vincent Calhoun made that choice? Had he been following someone? Had he been forced? The FBI established a timeline. The bus left Riverside Elementary at 8:45 in the morning. Based on the route, it should have reached its first major checkpoint, a rest stop on Interstate 79, by 9:30. It never arrived. That gave someone a 45-minute window to divert the bus, transport it to the burial site, and enter it. 45 minutes. It seemed impossible. Cell phone records from 1993 were limited, but investigators pulled phone logs from every residence and business within a 50-mile radius of the burial site. They found nothing unusual. No sudden increases in activity, no suspicious calls. Satellite imagery from that period was grainy and incomplete, but analysts reviewed every available frame from October 14, 1993. They saw nothing. Nothing. Forensic teams processed the bus as they would a crime scene, collecting samples of soil, fibers, fingerprints. They found prints belonging to the driver, the teachers, and many of the children, exactly as expected. But they also found prints that did not match anyone who should have been on that bus. Unidentified prints on the exterior door handle, on the driver's side window, on the emergency exit at the rear. Those prints were run through every database available: criminal records, military files, employment screenings. No matches. Mestes. Toxicology reports came back 6 weeks later, but every victim showed traces of a compound that forensic chemists struggled to identify. It was not a known poison. It was not a pharmaceutical drug. It was not a recreational substance. The molecular structure resembled nothing in existing databases, though chemists noted similarities to certain anesthetics and neurotoxins. Whatever this compound was, it had been introduced into the victim's systems shortly before death. But how? There were no injection marks, no signs of ingestion. And the compound appeared in lung tissue, suggesting inhalation, but there were no residues in the air inside the bus. It was as if the substance had appeared inside their bodies spontaneously. The ME assigned to the case, Dr. Hannah Frost, offered a preliminary assessment during a press conference in September 2024. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed by weeks of sleepless nights. She described the findings in careful, clinical language, but beneath the professionalism was something else. Fear. Confusion. She admitted that, in 23 years of forensic pathology, she had never encountered anything like this. The children had died simultaneously, or near simultaneously, from exposure to an unknown compound that should not exist. But there was no explanation for how they had been exposed. But there was no explanation for how someone had buried a bus without being seen. There was no explanation for any of it. Families received the news with a mixture of grief and rage. After 31 years of not knowing, they finally had answers. Their children were dead. But those answers raised 1,000 new questions. Who did this? Why? How? The FBI assured the public that the investigation was active, that every resource was being devoted to solving this case. But privately, investigators were grasping at shadows. In October 2024, a break came from an unexpected source. A retired construction worker named Albert Finch, 78 years old, contacted the FBI after seeing news coverage of the discovery. He remembered something from the fall of 1993. He had been working for a small excavation company that contracted with private landowners, digging drainage ditches and clearing sites. In October of that year, his boss, a man named Gregory Salter, had accepted a private job on short notice. Finch had not been involved directly, but he remembered Salter taking 2 other crew members and several pieces of heavy equipment to a location he refused to disclose. They had been gone for 3 days. When they returned, Salter paid them in cash and told them never to speak about the job. Finch thought it was strange but did not question it. Work was work. Was work. Investigators located Gregory Salter in a nursing home outside Pittsburgh. He was 89, suffering from advanced dementia, barely coherent. They tried to interview him multiple times, but his responses were fragmented, nonsensical. He spoke about digging, about darkness, about someone paying him a great deal of money. But he could not remember who. He could not remember why. His medical records showed he had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's in 2003, and by 2024, most of his long-term memory had deteriorated. If he knew the truth, it was locked inside a mind that could no longer retrieve it. The 2 crew members who had worked with Salter on that October job were both dead. One had died in a car accident in 1997. The other had succumbed to liver failure in 2011. Dead ends, literally. The FBI expanded their investigation, looking into Gregory Salter's financial records from 1993. They found a cash deposit of $30,000 made on October 20th, 1993, 6 days after the bus disappeared. The deposit slip listed the source as private contract work, but there was no accompanying documentation. No invoices, no contracts, no client names, just cash. $30,000 in 1993 was a significant sum, enough to buy silence, enough to ensure no questions were asked. But who paid him? Investigators traced every individual and organization that had interacted with Salter's company in 1993. They found landscaping clients, municipal contracts, routine business dealings. Nothing suspicious, nothing that connected to the missing bus. The money had appeared, been deposited, and vanished into the past. The discovery of the bus, rather than providing closure, had torn open new wounds. Families demanded justice, but justice requires a perpetrator, and there was no one to hold accountable. Theories multiplied again, wilder than before. Some believed it was a government operation gone wrong, children accidentally killed during some clandestine test. Others suspected a serial killer with resources and planning beyond anything previously documented. A few whispered about cults, rituals, sacrifices. The internet churned with speculation, amateur sleuths dissecting every detail, building elaborate narratives that had no basis in evidence. In November 2024, a journalist named Lena Wu published an investigative piece in a major national magazine, examining the case in exhaustive detail. She interviewed surviving family members, retired investigators, forensic experts. Her conclusion was grim. Unless someone came forward with information, this case would remain unsolved. The physical evidence pointed nowhere. The timeline made no sense. The deaths defied medical explanation. 30 children had been murdered by someone with the means, the knowledge, and the cold-blooded calculation to pull off a crime that seemed impossible. But the most chilling part of Wu's investigation came in the final paragraphs. She had obtained access to the original case file from 1993, including witness statements that had never been made public. One statement, buried in thousands of pages, came from a gas station attendant named Rita Vasquez. On the morning of October 14, 1993, Vasquez had been working at a service station along State Route 36, not far from the logging road that led to the burial site. She reported seeing a yellow school bus pass by around 9:15 in the morning. Behind it, she said, was a black van. She had not thought anything of it at the time. School buses were common. Vans were common, but something about the van stuck in her memory. It had no windows in the back. No markings, no license plate visible. And it had been following the bus closely, too closely. Rita Vasquez had given that statement to police on October 16, 1993. It had been filed away, one detail among thousands. She died of cancer in 2009, taking her memory of that morning with her. That black van, no windows, no plates, following a school bus full of children. The FBI issued a public appeal in December 2024, then asking anyone who remembered seeing a black van in the Millbrook area in October 1993 to come forward. They received over 300 tips. Most were useless, people misremembering or inventing details. But 7 individuals, all unconnected, reported seeing a similar van in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Always in the vicinity of Riverside Elementary. Always parked on side streets, engine running. One witness, a retired postal worker, remembered delivering mail to a house near the school and noticing the van parked across the street 3 days in a row. He had thought it was strange but assumed it belonged to a contractor working on one of the homes. The van had been watching, waiting, and planning. The murder. But who was inside? Where did it come from? Where did it go after? No one knew. The van, like the bus, had disappeared without a trace. It was a ghost vehicle, a phantom, real enough to be seen but impossible to track. By January 2025, the investigation had reached another impasse. The FBI continued processing evidence, continued chasing leads, but privately, agents acknowledged they were no closer to identifying a suspect than they had been the day the bus was found. The case consumed resources, manpower, public attention. Pressure mounted from families, from media, from politicians demanding answers. But answers require evidence, and the evidence pointed into a void. In February 2025, a documentary crew began filming a series about the case, interviewing everyone connected to the tragedy. They traveled to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, now a town of fewer than 800 residents, many of whom had not been there in 1993. They filmed the site where the bus had been buried, now marked with a simple memorial, 30 small stones arranged in a circle, each bearing the name of a child. They spoke with parents, some of whom were now elderly, their faces carved by decades of grief. The question every family asked was the same: why our children? What did they do to deserve this? The answer, of course, was nothing. They had done nothing. They had simply been children, excited about a field trip, unaware that the bus they boarded would become their tomb. But the investigation had uncovered one more troubling detail, something the FBI had kept quiet for months. The soil surrounding the bus, the dirt used to fill the pit, did not match the soil from the burial site. Laboratory analysis showed it had been transported from somewhere else, somewhere with different mineral content, different composition. Whoever buried the bus had brought in tons of foreign soil to cover it. Why? It made the task exponentially harder, required more time, more equipment, more planning. But it also served a purpose. It obscured the burial, made the site appear natural, undisturbed. It was the work of someone meticulous, someone experienced, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The FBI brought in geologists to analyze the soil, hoping to trace its origin. The results came back in March 2025. The soil was consistent with deposits found in western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and parts of West Virginia. Hundreds of potential sites. Too many to narrow down. Another dead end. Nay. And so, 31 years after 30 children boarded a school bus and disappeared, the world was left with a mystery that seemed designed to be unsolvable. Every answer led to more questions. Every clue dissolved into ambiguity. Somewhere, someone knew the truth. Someone had driven that van, paid Gregory Salter, introduced that unknown compound into the air inside the bus. Someone had watched those children die and buried them in silence. But that someone remained a shadow, invisible and untouchable, hiding behind decades of decay and deliberate obfuscation. The families waited. The investigators worked, and the questions hung in the air, unanswered, like ghosts that refused to rest. Because in the end, this was not just a story about missing children. It was a story about the darkness that lives in the margins, the evil that operates in plain sight, and the terrible reality that some crimes are committed so perfectly, so methodically, that justice may never reach them. The bus had been found. The children had been recovered. But the truth, the real truth, remained buried somewhere deeper than 15 feet of stolen soil, and it was unclear if anyone would ever dig it out. The spring of 2025 brought no resolution, only deeper complications. The FBI had expanded its investigative team, bringing in specialists from Quantico, behavioral analysts, forensic accountants, and cold case experts who had solved seemingly impossible crimes. They approached the mystery from every conceivable angle, building psychological profiles of potential suspects, mapping geographic patterns, analyzing the logistics of the crime with mathematical precision. But every model they constructed collapsed under scrutiny. The perpetrator, whoever they were, had left no signature, no pattern, no weakness to exploit. But in April, a development emerged from the most unexpected source: dental records. Dr. Paul Mendez, a forensic odontologist reviewing the remains, noticed something peculiar about one of the children. A boy named Trevor Whitman, 9 years old at the time of his death, had dental work that did not match his medical records. According to his pediatric dentist in Millbrook, Trevor had never had a cavity, never required any procedures beyond routine cleanings. But the remains showed a molar with a filling. Not just any filling, but a specific type of amalgam that had been phased out of use in the United States by 1988. Dr. Mendez brought this discrepancy to the attention of lead investigator Special Agent Nicole Brennan. At first, it seemed like a simple record-keeping error. Dental files from the early 90s were notoriously inconsistent, often handwritten, sometimes lost during office transitions. But Brennan, operating on instinct built from 20 years in the field, decided to investigate further. She contacted Trevor Whitman's mother, Catherine, now 64 and living in Arizona. Catherine Whitman remembered her son's teeth clearly. He had been proud of never having cavities, had earned a certificate from his dentist for excellent oral hygiene. She confirmed that Trevor had never received any dental work beyond cleanings. The filling Dr. Mendez had found should not exist. This anomaly triggered a comprehensive review of all 30 children. Over the following 6 weeks, forensic teams compared medical and dental records against the physical remains. They found 3 more discrepancies. Small things. A healed fracture in a radius bone that should not have been there. A surgical scar on an appendix that medical records showed had never been removed. Vaccination marks in patterns inconsistent with documented immunization schedules. The implications were staggering. Either the medical records were catastrophically inaccurate, or these were not the children who had boarded the bus that morning in October 1993. But that was impossible. DNA testing had already confirmed identities. Blood drawn from the children during routine school health screenings had been preserved in medical files, and those samples matched the remains found in the bus. Fingerprints taken during a safety program at Riverside Elementary matched prints on belongings inside the bus. These were absolutely, definitively the same 30 children. So how did their bodies contain medical histories that did not exist? Dr. Mendez proposed a theory that seemed to come straight from science fiction. The children had been kept alive after the initial abduction, not for hours or days, but for weeks, possibly months. During that time, they had sustained injuries, received medical treatment, lived through experiences that left physical marks on their bodies. Then, at some point, they had been returned to the bus and killed. The theory explained the discrepancies but raised horrifying new questions. Where had they been kept? Who had treated their injuries? Why had they been returned to the bus? And most chilling of all, what had happened to them during those missing weeks or months? Special Agent Brennan assembled a task force to explore this possibility. If the children had been held captive somewhere, there would be evidence. Shelters capable of housing 30 children would require significant infrastructure, plumbing, electricity, food supplies, waste disposal. Such a facility could not exist without leaving traces. The team began searching property records for abandoned buildings, warehouses, underground structures within a 100-mile radius of the burial site. They found dozens of possibilities. Old factory complexes shut down during the industrial decline of the 80s. Abandoned mining operations with extensive tunnel systems, and decommissioned military facilities mothballed after the Cold War. Each location was investigated, searched, processed, but they found nothing. No evidence of recent occupation, no signs that children had ever been held there. But in June 2025, a retired librarian named Constance Eller contacted the FBI with information that would shift the entire investigation. She had been sorting through old newspapers at the Millbrook Public Library, preparing to digitize archives, when she came across something peculiar. In the weeks following the disappearance, several families had reported receiving strange phone calls. Anonymous calls, no one speaking on the other end, just silence, sometimes the sound of breathing. The calls had come sporadically, always in the middle of the night, always lasting exactly 30 seconds before disconnecting. These reports had been filed with police in 1993 but dismissed as prank calls, the work of cruel teenagers or opportunistic disturbers exploiting a tragedy. In the chaos of the investigation, they had been deemed irrelevant. But Constance Eller had noticed something the original investigators had missed. The calls had stopped abruptly on December 3, 1993, exactly 7 weeks after the disappearance. And they had only been received by families whose children had been on the bus. Not random families, not other residents of Millbrook, but only the parents of the missing children. Special Agent Brennan obtained phone records from every affected family. In 1993, detailed call logs were less comprehensive than modern records, but telephone companies had maintained archives of long-distance and unusual activity. The records confirmed what the families had reported between October 15 and December 3, 1993. Each family received between 4 and 9 anonymous calls, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, always lasting approximately 30 seconds. But the most significant detail came from the technical analysis. The calls had not originated from a single location. They had come from payphones scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. 17 different payphones, none used more than once. But whoever made these calls had been traveling, moving constantly, using phones in different towns, different counties, never establishing a pattern. Why? What was the purpose of these calls? Brennan consulted with behavioral analysts, who offered several interpretations. It could have been psychological torture, a way to prolong the suffering of families already in agony. It could have been reconnaissance, testing whether families were home, monitoring their movements. Or it could have been something stranger, a form of communication. Someone trying to reach out without revealing themselves, perhaps struggling with guilt, perhaps wanting to confess but lacking the courage. The geographic distribution of the payphones formed an irregular pattern across 3 states, but when plotted on a map, they seemed to cluster around certain areas. Analysts noticed that several calls had originated from towns near abandoned industrial sites, near old mining regions, near rural areas with sparse populations. The pattern was too vague to be definitive but suggestive enough to warrant further investigation. Teams were dispatched to each payphone location. Most of the phones no longer existed, removed during infrastructure upgrades in the late 90s and early 2000s. But investigators canvassed surrounding businesses, showed photographs of the children, asked if anyone remembered seeing anything unusual in late 1993, and they interviewed residents, pored over old security footage where it still existed, searched for any thread that might connect these locations to the missing bus. In July 2025, they found something. A gas station owner in a small Ohio town named Garrison remembered a black van from that period, not because of the van itself, but because of the man who drove it. The owner, a man named Dale Pruitt, now 71, had kept meticulous records of every transaction at his station for decades. It was a habit born from obsessive organization, the kind of personality trait that made him an unlikely goldmine for investigators. Pruitt remembered the van because the driver had paid for gas with a $100 bill at 2 in the morning. In 1993, that was unusual. Credit cards were becoming more common, and most people did not carry that much cash, especially not at that hour. And the driver had been nervous, fidgety, avoiding eye contact. Pruitt had made note of it in his personal log, a spiral notebook where he recorded interesting or strange occurrences. He still had that notebook. The entry was dated November 8, 1993. The description was brief: black van, no rear windows. Driver male, 40s, scruffy beard, paid 100 for 20 in gas. Acted weird. Left heading west on Route 32. It was the first tangible description of anyone potentially connected to the crime. Male, 40s, beard. Not much, but more than investigators had possessed before. Pruitt could not remember additional details. It had been 32 years. But he was certain about the van and the $100 bill because he had joked with his wife about it later that night. Someone with money to burn, he had said, filling up a van at 2 in the morning. The FBI worked with forensic artists to create a composite sketch based on Pruitt's description, though everyone acknowledged its limitations. Memory degrades over time, especially details like facial features. The sketch was released to the media in late July, accompanied by a renewed appeal for information. Anyone who recognized the individual or had seen a similar van in late 1993 was urged to come forward. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of tips flooded in, most useless, many from people genuinely trying to help but misremembering or conflating different events. But among the noise, several tips pointed toward the same individual, a man named Leonard Cray. Leonard Cray had been a transient in the early 90s, drifting between Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, picking up odd jobs, living out of his vehicle. But multiple witnesses remembered him because he drove a black van with no rear windows. He had done landscaping work, manual labor, occasional construction. He matched the age range and general description from Dale Pruitt's account. But Leonard Cray had died in 1997, killed in a bar fight in Wheeling, West Virginia. He was buried in a pauper's grave, no family, no estate, no records beyond a brief criminal history involving minor offenses, trespassing, petty theft, drunken disorderly conduct. The investigators exhumed his remains in August 2025. DNA testing confirmed the identity and forensic anthropologists conducted a thorough examination. They found no evidence linking him directly to the crime, no physical traces that connected him to the children or the bus. His van had been sold for scrap after his death, long since destroyed. But the circumstantial connections were compelling. He had been in the right places at the right times. He had owned a vehicle matching witness descriptions. He had the kind of rootless, transient lifestyle that would allow someone to move freely without attracting attention. Behavioral analysts constructed a profile of Leonard Cray based on available records. He had been a loner, distrustful of authority, prone to paranoia. He had no history of violence against children, but his criminal record suggested someone comfortable operating outside the law. Interviews with people who had known him painted a picture of a man who kept to himself, who spoke little and revealed even less. Some described him as odd, unsettling, the kind of person you avoided instinctively without knowing exactly why. But dead men cannot answer questions. If Leonard Cray had been involved, his secrets had died with him in that bar fight in 1997. The FBI investigated his known associates, tracked down anyone who had worked with him or crossed paths with him during the early 90s, Most were dead or could not remember him clearly. A few recalled him mentioning jobs he would not discuss, work that paid well but required discretion. One former co-worker remembered Cray coming into money in late 1993, enough to pay off debts and buy new tools. When asked where the money came from, Cray had simply said he had helped someone with a project. Was Leonard Cray the man in the van? Had he been the one who followed the school bus, who helped bury it, who made those anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night? The evidence was circumstantial but building. The sponsor at Doe. Special Agent Brennan felt they were closer than ever to identifying at least one person involved. But even if Cray had participated, he had not acted alone. Burying a bus, keeping 30 children captive, administering an unknown compound, orchestrating the entire operation required resources, planning, and expertise beyond what a transient laborer could provide. And there had to be someone else. Someone with money, with access to sophisticated materials, with the cold intelligence to design a crime that defied explanation. Someone who had hired Leonard Cray, paid Gregory Salter, and walked away clean while everyone else became evidence or corpses. In September 2025, the toxicology findings were updated. The unknown compound found in the children's remains had been partially identified through advanced mass spectrometry. It was a synthetic molecule, not naturally occurring, with structural elements resembling both anesthetics and nerve agents. The chemist who led the analysis, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, described it as something designed for a specific purpose, to render victims unconscious quickly and induce death without visible trauma. It was, she said, the kind of compound that would require access to specialized equipment and knowledge of organic chemistry, not something an amateur could produce in a basement. This was the work of someone trained, someone with a laboratory, someone who understood exactly what they were creating. The FBI consulted with military and intelligence agencies, asking if any such compound had been developed for covert operations. The responses were classified, but unofficially sources confirmed that similar research had been conducted during the Cold War. Compounds designed for silent elimination, for scenarios where traditional methods were too conspicuous. But those programs had been shut down in the 80s, materials destroyed, researchers dispersed into academia or private industry. And had someone from that world gone rogue? Had a former chemist with clearance and expertise decided to use their knowledge for something unspeakable? The theory was plausible, but proving it required identifying specific individuals with the right background who had been active in Pennsylvania in 1993. The list was surprisingly long. Dozens of former military chemists, pharmaceutical researchers, and academics had lived or worked in the region during that period. Investigating each one would take years, but time was running out. Public pressure was mounting. Families demanded arrests, demanded justice, demanded something tangible after 32 years of nothing. Media coverage had reached a fever pitch, with the case dominating headlines and true crime programs. The FBI was under intense scrutiny, every decision analyzed, every delay criticized. But in October 2025, exactly 32 years after the disappearance, Special Agent Brennan held a press conference. She stood before a wall of microphones, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Her face was composed, professional, but those who knew her could see the exhaustion behind her eyes. She announced that the investigation had identified persons of interest, that significant progress had been made, but that no arrests were imminent. She asked for patience, for continued cooperation from the public, for anyone with information to come forward. The families sat in the front row, their expressions a mixture of hope and despair. They had heard promises before. They had watched investigations stall and fade. This time felt different, but different did not mean resolved. After the press conference, Brennan returned to her office and spread the case files across her desk. Thousands of pages. Decades of work. Somewhere in this mountain of information was the answer. Somewhere was the connection that would unravel the whole thing. She could feel it, the way you feel a storm approaching before you see the clouds. 3 days later, a letter arrived at FBI headquarters. It had been mailed from a post office in rural Kentucky. No return address, no identifying marks. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in block letters. The message was brief. "You are looking in the wrong place. The children saw something they should not have seen. The bus was not the beginning. It was the end. Look at what happened in September. Look at the facility. Look at the facility." No signature, no explanation, just those cryptic sentences. Brennan read the letter a dozen times, analyzing every word. What facility? What had happened in September? September of what year? 1993? Earlier. The letter was maddeningly vague, but it felt legitimate. Not the work of an attention seeker or conspiracy theorist, but someone with actual knowledge. The FBI launched a new line of inquiry, searching for incidents or events that had occurred in September 1993, anything that might connect to Millbrook or the surrounding areas. They reviewed accident reports, police logs, news archives. They found dozens of events, most mundane, none obviously connected to 30 missing children. But then an analyst named Marcus Webb noticed something. In September 1993, a chemical manufacturing plant in Ohio, about 50 miles from the burial site, had experienced a minor incident. A leak in a storage tank containing experimental compounds. The leak had been contained quickly, no injuries reported, no major contamination. The facility had filed the required reports with environmental agencies, paid a small fine, and continued operations. The incident had been deemed insignificant. The facility was called Meridian Chemical Industries, and it no longer existed. The company had been dissolved in 2001 following bankruptcy, the plant dismantled and the land sold. But records showed that in the early 90s, Meridian had been involved in contract work for defense and pharmaceutical clients, developing compounds for various applications, classified applications. Webb dug deeper. He found employment records, lists of personnel who had worked at Meridian during 1993. One name stood out, Dr. Raymond Fisher, a chemist with a PhD in organic synthesis, specializing in anesthetics and neuropharmacology. Fisher had worked at Meridian from 1989 to 1995, then left abruptly, his whereabouts afterward unclear. Brennan authorized a full background check on Raymond Fisher, and the results painted a disturbing picture. Fisher had been a brilliant but unstable individual, known for pushing ethical boundaries, for conducting experiments that made colleagues uncomfortable. He had been investigated twice for safety violations at Meridian, though no formal charges were filed. After leaving Meridian, he had vanished from public records. No employment history, no tax filings, no address. It was as if he had ceased to exist. But people do not just disappear. Brennan assigned a team to track Fisher to find any trace of him from 1995 to the present. It took weeks, but they eventually found a trail. Fisher had been living under an assumed name in rural Virginia, working as a consultant for small biotech firms, projects that never quite materialized, money that came from sources difficult to trace. He had been careful, but not careful enough. On November 19, 2025, FBI agents surrounded a farmhouse outside Charlottesville, Virginia. They had a warrant for the arrest of Raymond Fisher, now 73 years old, on charges related to the 1993 deaths. The operation was conducted quietly, no media present, no advance warning. Fisher did not resist. He was seated on his porch when agents arrived, drinking coffee, as if he had been expecting them. He looked at Special Agent Brennan with a calm, almost serene expression and said 5 words, "You will never understand why." He was taken into custody and transported to a federal facility. During the initial interrogation, Fisher refused to speak, invoking his right to an attorney. But his home was searched, and what agents found there confirmed their worst suspicions. A laboratory hidden in the basement, still functional after all these years. Equipment for synthesizing complex organic compounds. The notebooks filled with chemical formulas, experimental results, annotations in Fisher's handwriting, and photographs. Dozens of photographs of children. Not the children from the bus, but others. Different faces, different years. a record of something far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The photographs were sent for analysis. Facial recognition software identified several of the children as missing persons from the 80s and 90s, cases that had never been solved. Cold cases scattered across multiple states, children who had disappeared without explanation, their bodies never recovered. The scope of Raymond Fisher's crimes began to reveal itself. He had not acted once. He had acted repeatedly over years, perfecting his methods, refining his techniques. The Millbrook bus was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a long series of experiments, a final test of his capabilities. But why? What had driven a trained chemist with a promising career to become a serial killer of children? Interrogators pressed him, but Fisher remained silent, his eyes empty, his demeanor detached. Psychiatric evaluations suggested profound antisocial personality disorder, a complete absence of empathy, a mind that viewed human beings as objects, as variables in an equation. The anonymous letter had been accurate. The children had seen something. In September 1993, the bus driver, Vincent Calhoun, had been contracted to transport a group of students to a science demonstration at Meridian Chemical Industries. It was a routine educational visit, arranged through the school's science program. The children had toured the facility, seen presentations about chemistry and manufacturing, but during that tour, something had happened. Something they witnessed that they were never supposed to see. Investigators reviewed records from the September visit and found a report filed by one of the teachers who accompanied the students. Miss Diane Porter, the same teacher who would die on the bus 2 weeks later. Her report mentioned that several children had wandered off during the tour, opening a door they had been told not to open, seeing something inside a restricted laboratory. The report was vague about what they saw, but it noted that Dr. Fisher had become agitated, insisting the children be removed immediately. Miss Porter had apologized, gathered the students, and left. She thought nothing more of it. But Fisher had thought about it. He had obsessed over it. Those children had seen his work, his experiments, his research that existed outside official channels. And they were witnesses to something that could not be allowed to exist. And so he had made a decision. He would eliminate the problem. All of it. 30 children, 2 teachers, 1 bus driver, and everyone who had been at the facility that day. But he had planned meticulously. Hired Leonard Cray to follow the bus. Paid Gregory Salter to dig the pit. Synthesized the compound that would kill without leaving obvious traces. And on October 14, 1993, he had intercepted the bus on its way to the nature reserve, redirected it to a remote location, introduced his compound into the ventilation system, and waited for everyone inside to die. Then, with Cray's help, the bus had been driven to the burial site and interred. The anonymous phone calls had been Fisher's way of monitoring the families, ensuring they were not getting too close to the truth. He had enjoyed it, the power, the control, the knowledge that he could reach into their lives whenever he chose. As for the medical discrepancies found in the children's remains, they were the result of Fisher's experiments. He had not killed the children immediately. He had kept them alive, unconscious, for weeks, using them as test subjects for various compounds, documenting their physiological responses, and treating injuries that occurred during his procedures. It was methodical, clinical, monstrous. When his research was complete, he had returned them to the bus and administered the final dose. Raymond Fisher was charged with 33 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous other federal crimes. His trial, scheduled for mid-2026, would be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in American history. But even as the legal process moved forward, questions remained. Fisher acted alone, or were there others involved in his research, colleagues who knew what he was doing and said nothing? What had become of the other children in those photographs, the ones from earlier years? Where were their bodies? And perhaps most troubling, what had Fisher discovered through his experiments? What knowledge had he gained from the suffering of innocent children? The FBI continued to investigate, but Fisher refused to cooperate. He sat in his cell, silent and unrepentant, his secrets locked behind a mind that had long ago abandoned any connection to humanity. And the families, after 32 years, finally had answers. Not the answers they wanted, not closure that brought peace, but answers nonetheless. Their children had been murdered by a man who viewed them as nothing more than data points. There was no greater purpose, no conspiracy, no mystery beyond the simple, terrible fact of evil existing in human form. Millbrook, Pennsylvania began the slow process of healing. The memorial at the burial site grew, people leaving flowers, toys, messages. And the town would never recover what it had lost, but perhaps it could learn to carry the weight differently. In December 2025, Special Agent Nicole Brennan stood at the burial site alone, long after the cameras had left, long after the crowds had dispersed. Snow was beginning to fall, soft and silent, covering the ground where 30 children had been found. She thought about the case, about the years it had taken, about the evil she had witnessed in Raymond Fisher's eyes. Justice would be served. Fisher would spend the rest of his life in prison, or more likely, face execution. But justice did not erase what had happened. It did not bring back the children. It did not undo 32 years of suffering for families who had waited for answers. She thought about the letter that had arrived, the anonymous message that had pointed them toward the truth. Who had sent it? Someone who knew, someone who had perhaps worked with Fisher, who had finally decided that silence was too heavy to carry. The handwriting had been analyzed, but no match was found. Whoever sent that letter had disappeared back into anonymity, their conscience cleared by a single act of courage. As Brennan walked back to her car, her phone rang. It was her assistant, calling with news. Another body had been found. A child, buried in the woods near where Fisher had lived in Virginia. Preliminary examination suggested the remains were from the mid-90s. Brennan closed her eyes, feeling the weight settle on her shoulders again. This case was not over. It would never truly be over. Raymond Fisher had spent decades perfecting his crimes, and the evidence suggested there were more victims, more families waiting for answers they did not yet know they needed. She started her car and drove back toward the city, leaving the memorial behind, the snow falling heavier now, covering everything in white. Somewhere ahead was more work, more investigations, more horrors to uncover. But that was the job. That was what justice required. Behind her, in the darkness, the memorial stood silent. 30 stones bearing 30 names. Children who had gone on a field trip and never came home. Children who had seen something they should not have seen and paid the ultimate price. Their story was over, but the ripples of what happened would continue spreading outward, touching lives, changing people, reminding the world that evil does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, methodically, wearing a human face. And sometimes, even when you catch it, even when you drag it into the light and make it answer for what it has done, the darkness it leaves behind never fully disappears. And the snow continued to fall. The names remained carved in stone, and 30 families carried their grief forward, one day at a time, into a future their children would never see.